Welcome to Translano. Hey, there. I'm so glad you're here. This is a space where we celebrate self-expression, individuality, and empowerment. I used to think personal identity was something you were handed early in life, like a name stitched into a backpack, useful, permanent, not really up for debate. The older I get, the more I realize identity is closer to handwriting, influenced by who taught you, shaped by what you're afraid to say out loud, and capable of changing when you finally slow down enough to see what you've been pretending not to notice. When I was a kid, I learned the rules before I learned the reasons. Boys don't cry. Boys don't linger in front of mirrors. Boys don't ask questions that make adults go quiet in that particular way, the way that makes you feel like you've reached for a hot stove. My parents weren't cruel, not even close. They were busy. They were doing what most people do, trying to keep a household running, trying to raise a child into something like normal, because normal sounded safer than complicated. I was good at following instructions. Teachers liked me. Coaches didn't know what to do with me. I did my best to become the kind of boy that didn't require extra explanations. But there were moments, small, private ones, that didn't fit into the neat story I told everyone else. I remember being around 8 or 9, home alone for a few minutes before my parents got back, and wandering into my mom's room like it was a museum after closing. I didn't take anything. I didn't have a plan. I just opened a drawer and touched fabric that felt different from mine, lighter, smoother, like it belonged to a world where you didn't have to brace your shoulders all the time. I don't think it was rebellion. It felt more like curiosity with a pulse. I remember holding a blouse up against myself and feeling a strange, quiet relief, the kind that arrives before you have language for it. Then I heard the garage door and my body moved faster than my thoughts. I shut the drawer, backed away, and stood in the hallway with my heart hammering like I'd done something terrible. That was my first lesson in secrecy. The thing itself wasn't what scared me as much as the idea of being seen wanting it. In middle school and high school, the world got louder about gender. It got louder about everything. Other kids performed masculinity like a sport, who could be less bothered, who could be more sarcastic, who could pretend they didn't need anyone. I learned to laugh at jokes that made my stomach tighten. I learned to keep my hands out of my pockets so I wouldn't fidget. I learned that if you were quiet, people would decide you were thoughtful, and if you were thoughtful, they might leave you alone. I became the kind of person who could disappear in a room without actually leaving it. The confusing part was that I didn't hate being a boy. I didn't wake up every day feeling like my body was an enemy. I didn't have a single, clear storyline where everything pointed in one direction. What I had were flashes, moments when certain clothes, certain gestures, certain ways of moving through the world felt like they carried a permission I didn't know how to ask for. I'd watch someone in a fitted skirt and a clean blouse walk with calm precision through a hallway, and the feeling that rose up in me wasn't desire in the way people assume. It was recognition. It was the sense that there was a version of me that knew how to breathe like that, if I ever let it. I also learned to fear what I couldn't categorize. Fear is efficient like that, it takes anything ambiguous and labels it dangerous, because danger is easier to manage than uncertainty. College gave me distance from my hometown, but it didn't give me clarity right away. If anything, distance made the questions louder because I couldn't distract myself with familiar routines. I tried on identities the way you try on majors. I told myself I was just stressed. I told myself I was just lonely. I told myself it was normal to have odd curiosities and that I'd grow out of them like I grew out of childhood obsessions. The first time I actually crossdressed, not in a joke way, not for a costume party, not with the safety net of irony, I didn't do it because I was brave. I did it because I was exhausted. I was 20, in a cramped off-campus apartment, and my roommate was gone for the weekend. I'd been carrying a heavy, restless sadness that didn't have a clear reason, the kind that makes you feel ungrateful for your own life. I'd gotten good grades, I had friends, I had plans, and yet I felt like I was living behind glass. A friend had left a small bag of clothes at our place after a study session, she'd changed for a dance rehearsal and forgotten her things. I texted her that she could pick them up whenever. Later that night, with the apartment quiet and my mind spinning, I opened the bag. I want to be careful here, because people sometimes turn this subject into spectacle or secret thrill. That wasn't what it was. It felt closer to trying on a new posture after years of tension. I slipped into a simple skirt and a plain top, nothing dramatic, nothing glamorous. My hands shook. I looked at myself and felt my face heat with shame before anything else could happen. Then, slowly, something softened. The person in the mirror didn't look like a punchline. They looked like me, just arranged differently. The feeling wasn't fireworks. It was quiet. It was like walking into a room where the volume of your thoughts drops. And then, almost immediately, guilt arrived. Not because I thought clothes had moral weight, but because I'd used someone else's belongings without asking. I took them off, folded them carefully, and sat on the edge of my bed feeling both calmer and worse, like I'd discovered a soothing medicine and then scolded myself for touching the bottle. That was another lesson. Even when something is meaningful, you can still handle it irresponsibly if you're desperate. I apologized to my friend later, not with full details, but with enough honesty to take responsibility. She laughed like it was nothing and said, "You're fine, just don't stretch anything." She meant it kindly. I took it as permission and also as a reminder that I hadn't actually risked anything real because I hadn't been fully seen. After that, I oscillated between curiosity and avoidance. I'd have months where the thought disappeared under work and social life. Then I'd have nights where I couldn't sleep because I kept replaying that moment of quiet recognition, and the way my body had felt less like an obligation and more like a home I might be allowed to decorate. I graduated, got a job, learned to wear competence like armor. The workplace rewarded certainty. People liked simple narratives, who you were, what you wanted, where you were going. I gave them what they wanted because it made life easier. I found myself moving through days like I was holding something fragile in my chest, careful not to drop it, careful not to show it. When I was 26, I started having what I can only describe as a low-grade panic that lasted for months. Nothing dramatic happened. No single crisis. Just an accumulating sense that I was living someone else's schedule. I woke up tired, worked tired, came home tired, and scrolled my phone until I could fall asleep. On paper, I was fine. In my body, I was slowly disappearing. Around that time, I started reading, not in a frantic way, more like a person quietly opening doors they'd been trained to keep locked. I found an American Psychological Association page that separated concepts I'd always tangled together, gender identity as an internal sense of self, and gender expression as the outward ways we communicate that self through clothing, behavior, and appearance. It also said, plainly, that cross-dressing can be a form of gender expression and isn't automatically tied to sexuality or to a desire for medical transition, which mattered to me because I kept trying to force myself into one neat explanation and failing. I stared at a photo on that page, two transgender individuals standing side by side, and I realized how hungry I was for ordinary representations, for images that weren't jokes or scandals, just people existing. Source. I also read the NHS description of gender dysphoria, not because I was trying to diagnose myself through a screen, but because it helped to see discomfort and unease described without mockery. It said gender dysphoria can involve a mismatch between biological sex and gender identity and that the distress, not the identity itself, is what causes harm, and that it isn't a mental illness, even though it can contribute to anxiety or depression. That distinction landed in me like a weight shifting. It suggested I wasn't broken for feeling what I felt, but I might be suffering because I'd been handling it alone and treating it like a shameful secret. Source. Still, reading is one thing. Living is another. I didn't come out to anyone because I wasn't even sure what I would be coming out as. I didn't want to borrow language that didn't fit. I didn't want to claim an experience that wasn't mine. I also didn't want to keep shrinking. That's how I arrived in a hotel room on a business trip with a suitcase that wasn't mine. It was supposed to be a routine trip, 2 nights in a mid-sized city, a daytime training session, and a networking event that evening with people I wanted to impress. I was tired before I even left. At the hotel, the lobby was busy, and the check-in line moved with that weary efficiency of people who'd all had flights delayed and emails piling up. I checked in, took the elevator up, and when I reached my room I saw my suitcase outside the door where I'd left it for a moment while juggling my keycard and laptop bag. Except it wasn't my suitcase. It was the same brand. The same model. The same size. It even had the same colored tag, some generic bright strip that could have belonged to anyone. My brain refused to believe what my eyes were telling it until I unzipped it and found neatly folded clothing that definitely wasn't mine. For a few seconds I just stood there, staring like the scene might rewrite itself if I waited. Then my stomach dropped. I'd grabbed the wrong one somewhere between the lobby and the hallway, and someone else had mine. I checked the hallway. Empty. I called the front desk. The person sounded apologetic but swamped. "We'll send someone up," they said, "but it may take a bit, there's a conference in-house." I looked at the clock. I had less than an hour before I needed to leave for the networking event. The event had a dress code, and I brought exactly one formal outfit because I'm the kind of person who plans for the minimum and hopes nothing goes wrong. My formal outfit was now traveling through the building in someone else's hands. I don't know what I expected to find in the suitcase, but the problem presented itself immediately. The clothing inside was unmistakably feminine. Not theatrical, not costume-like. Just a sleek blouse, a fitted skirt, and a pair of heels placed carefully in a shoe bag. There were also basic makeup items, a small pouch of accessories, and a simple black blazer that looked like it meant business. My first thought was, absolutely not. My second thought was, you do not have time to have a philosophical debate with yourself. I paced the room, phone in hand, refreshing my email like it might contain a solution. I called the front desk again. Same answer, same apology. I could have skipped the event, but skipping it would have consequences. It wasn't just social. I'd been trying to be taken seriously at work, trying to prove I could represent my team. A colleague had arranged introductions. If I didn't show, people would notice. People would talk. And I was tired of being the person who disappeared. I also knew the ethical line, these weren't my clothes. Wearing them was not the intended use. Even if it was temporary, it was still using someone else's belongings. I stood in the bathroom and stared at my reflection under harsh light, trying to imagine the least harmful option. My mind ran through scenarios like a risk assessment report. If I wore something casual, I'd be underdressed and uncomfortable all night, and it would show. If I stayed back, I'd miss the event and feel the familiar self-disgust of choosing avoidance again. If I wore the outfit, I'd be crossing an intimate boundary and risking being seen in a way I wasn't prepared for. In the end, what decided it was a thought that felt both practical and honest. I could treat this as survival mode, but I would handle it with respect. I would not treat the clothes like a joke. I would not damage anything. I would do everything in my power to return them clean, exactly as I found them, and I would report the mix-up immediately and keep reporting it until it was resolved. I showered quickly, hands moving on autopilot, and then I stood over the open suitcase like it was asking me a question I'd been avoiding for years. Putting on the blouse felt like stepping across a line drawn in invisible ink. The fabric felt differently than my shirts. The buttons forced me to slow down. The skirt required attention, how it sat at my waist, how I moved my legs. It wasn't a costume, it was a set of instructions. I pulled the blazer on over it and looked at myself in the mirror. I expected my face to betray me with panic, with humiliation, with the ridiculous I'd been trained to anticipate. Instead, something in me settled. Not perfectly. Not like a miracle. But like a puzzle piece turning slightly and finding a groove. I caught my own eyes in the mirror and felt a jolt of grief so sharp it surprised me. The grief wasn't about the outfit. It was about time, about how long I'd been living as if the parts of me that wanted softness and precision and a different kind of presence were childish or shameful, about how many mornings I'd looked at myself and accepted a vague discomfort as the price of adulthood. The heels were a problem. I'd never walked in heels. I put them on and immediately understood why people can look powerful and miserable at the same time. My ankles wobbled. I grabbed the dresser to steady myself. I tried a few steps on the carpet and almost laughed, partly from nerves, partly from disbelief. I considered taking them off and wearing my own shoes, but my shoes were in the suitcase I didn't have. I stared at the door. The clock. The mirror again. Just get through the night, I told myself out loud. My voice sounded too loud in the room, like someone else had spoken. I left the hotel with my heart thudding, each step carefully placed. In the elevator, I stood in the corner and tried not to make eye contact. I watched the numbers light up and felt like I was watching my own life from a distance. When the doors opened in the lobby, I braced myself for laughter or whispers or the kind of stare that makes you feel like you've been reduced to a question. But the lobby was crowded, and the world, as it turns out, doesn't always pause to judge you. People hurried past with rolling bags and coffee cups and phones pressed to their ears. A woman glanced at me and then looked away, not because she was being kind, but because she had her own life to manage. Outside, the air was cool. I walked slowly, focusing on posture the way I'd focus on a presentation, shoulders down, chin level, pace steady. I kept telling myself that if I acted like I belonged, maybe my fear would be quieter. The networking event was in a hotel ballroom at another venue, all soft lighting and name tags and clusters of people laughing too loudly. I signed in with shaking hands. The person at the table smiled at me without hesitation and handed me a badge. That was the moment the terror changed shape. It wasn't that I was suddenly safe. It was that I realized how much of my fear had been built in advance, rehearsed, internal. The room didn't explode. No one pointed. No one demanded an explanation. The world, for better and worse, kept moving. I spent the first half hour trying not to be recognized by someone from work, which was almost absurd because I was also trying to be noticed by the right people. I held a drink I barely touched and listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I kept my voice steady and my answers short, the way I always did when I felt exposed. And then something strange happened. I started to feel calm. Not because the risk vanished. Not because I suddenly wanted to make a statement. The calm came from the fact that for the first time in months, maybe longer, my internal life and my external presence weren't at war. I wasn't performing a version of myself that felt like a compromise. I was still me, same memories, same skills, same awkwardness, but I was moving through the room with a kind of alignment that made my thoughts less noisy. I remember standing near a table of brochures, listening to a speaker describe market trends, and realizing I could actually hear them. My mind wasn't buzzing with self-correction. I wasn't mentally policing every gesture. I was just there. Of course, the fear returned whenever someone familiar crossed my sightline. I ducked into the restroom once and sat in a stall, breathing through the tightness in my chest. I texted the front desk again, asking for an update, and received a brief message, still trying to locate. Sorry for delay. I looked at my hands, at the way the sleeves ended at my wrists, at the careful simplicity of the outfit, and felt an unexpected surge of respect for the person who owned it. Whoever she was, she had built a capsule of professionalism, clothes chosen not to attract attention but to claim space. There was a kind of dignity in that, and wearing it without permission began to feel heavier as the night wore on. Near the end of the event, as people started to drift toward the exit and exchange last business cards, someone touched my elbow gently. I turned and saw a woman about my age, maybe a little older, with tired eyes and a mouth that looked like it had practiced holding back opinions. She looked me up and down, and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach because recognition had finally arrived, just not the kind I'd expected. That blazer, she said quietly, not accusing, not loud enough for others to hear. I know that blazer. My mouth went dry. For a second I couldn't form words. I imagined security. I imagined shouting. I imagined my career ending in a hotel ballroom. I started, and then stopped, because there was no graceful lie that wouldn't make it worse. She waited, arms loosely crossed, expression unreadable. I think I took the wrong suitcase, I said, forcing the words out like I was lifting something heavy. Same brand, same tag color. I called the front desk. I've been trying to get it fixed. I had to come here for work. I didn't know what else to do. I swallowed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Her face changed, not into anger, but into something like reluctant amusement. The corner of her mouth twitched. So you're the one who has my life in a suitcase, she said, and the way she said it, dry, almost gentle, made my eyes sting with relief so intense I hated myself for it. I didn't mean to, I said again, and I meant it. I know, she said. If you meant to, you would have styled it better. She glanced at my shoes, and I realized with a sick embarrassment that my walking had probably been as cautious as a person crossing ice. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Are you okay? I asked, because suddenly the ethical reality landed fully. She'd been without her suitcase too. She'd been inconvenienced, maybe worse. She might have had her own event, her own needs. I'm okay, she said. Annoyed, yes. But okay. The front desk gave me a spare set of toiletries, and a voucher like that fixes everything. She looked at me more carefully, and her voice softened. You look like you're trying not to disappear. The sentence hit me with a quiet force. I didn't know how to answer, so I didn't. My silence must have been enough. She sighed and shifted her bag on her shoulder. Listen, she said. I'm not angry. You didn't steal this to be cruel. But we should fix it properly. I'll go to the front desk right now, I said quickly. I'll return everything exactly. Good, she said. Then she hesitated, as if deciding whether to say the next part. Also, she added, if you're going to walk back across a lobby in those heels, you're going to hurt yourself. I blinked. I'm managing, I lied. You're surviving, she corrected, and there was no judgment in it. There's a difference. We left the ballroom together, not as friends exactly, but as two people temporarily bound by a mistake and the choice of what to do next. In the quiet of the hallway outside, she opened her bag and pulled out a small compact and a tube of something neutral. Do you mind, she asked, gesturing toward my face. I don't, I started, and then realized I didn't know what I was refusing. Kindness? Help? The risk of being seen more clearly? Okay, I said. I don't know what I'm doing. Obviously, she said, but she said it like a sibling would, with blunt affection. She dabbed a little concealer under my eyes, not to transform me, just to soften the tiredness I'd been carrying for months. She smoothed my hair back and adjusted the collar of the blazer so it sat cleanly. This isn't about looking like someone else, she said quietly, as if she knew the story my brain was trying to write. It's about looking like you're allowed to be here. I nodded, throat tight. And the walking, she added, stepping back. Shorter steps. Put your weight down through the heel first, then roll forward. Let your arms swing naturally. Don't clutch your bag like it's a shield. You're not sneaking. You're arriving. I tried it, one step, then another. It wasn't elegant, but it was steadier. Better, she said. Now, you need to practice saying this sentence, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'll make it right. Without collapsing into shame. I almost laughed, but it came out as a breathy sound. At the hotel desk, we explained the mix-up. The staff apologized with the kind of panic that arrives when a problem becomes real to them. They called housekeeping. They called security. They produced my suitcase from behind a door like it had been hiding on purpose. The woman received hers back too, and I watched her unzip it briefly, checking for anything missing. She didn't look at me like I was a thief. She looked at me like I was a person who had made a mistake and then chosen not to lie about it. I asked if anything had been damaged. I offered to pay for cleaning. I meant it. She waved it off at first, then paused and said, actually, pay it forward. Be decent to yourself. People are cruel enough without you joining in. Before we parted ways, she gave me her first name and a business card. If you want, she said, you can email me later. Not to apologize again. I heard you. Just, if you ever need to talk to someone who won't turn it into a spectacle. I took the card carefully, as if it might dissolve. Thank you, I said, and for once the words didn't feel like a script. They felt like truth. Back in my room, with my own suitcase finally beside the bed, I took off the borrowed outfit slowly. I checked every seam for damage like I was returning a museum artifact. I folded each item exactly as I'd found it, placed everything back in the suitcase, and zipped it with hands that were finally steady. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I expected to feel relieved that the crisis was over. I did feel relief, but it was mixed with something else, something like mourning, something like clarity. Because the night hadn't been a disaster. It hadn't been humiliating. It hadn't exposed me the way my fear promised it would. It had exposed something different, how much energy I'd been spending on not knowing myself. The next morning, I went to the front desk early and made sure the suitcase was returned to its owner with an apology note. I didn't include details that weren't mine to share, and I didn't make it about me. I kept it simple. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Thank you for your patience. I'm grateful it was resolved. On the flight home, I watched clouds slide beneath the window and tried to name what had happened without exaggerating it. I hadn't become someone else overnight. I hadn't solved identity like it was a riddle. What I had done was experience, in a very real and very accidental way, that my sense of self didn't collapse when my gender expression shifted. If anything, parts of me felt more stable. I also realized something uncomfortable. I'd been treating my own curiosity like a threat, and that had been costing me mental health. For months, maybe years, I'd been living with a constant background strain, the effort of holding a door shut with my whole body. No wonder I was tired. When I got home, I didn't rush into declarations. I didn't throw out my wardrobe or reinvent myself in a weekend. I cleaned my apartment, did my laundry, answered my work emails. I tried to re-enter my life the way you re-enter a room after a loud noise, carefully, listening for echoes. But I couldn't unsee the mirror from that hotel bathroom, the moment when I realized I didn't look ridiculous. I looked right, not a right as in finished, not a right as in explained, but right as in aligned, like a chord resolving. The phrase kept returning at odd times, in meetings, in the grocery store, in the quiet right before sleep. I did what I should have done earlier. I found a therapist. Not one who would tell me who I was, not one who would push me toward an identity I didn't claim, but one who understood that exploring gender expression and identity can be part of mental wellness, part of learning how to live honestly without harming yourself or others. In those sessions, I said things out loud that I'd only ever thought in fragments. I talked about fear, fear of being mocked, fear of disappointing my parents, fear of losing professional credibility, fear that I'd open a door and never be able to close it. My therapist kept bringing me back to responsibility. Not the harsh kind I'd grown up with, the kind that sounds like punishment, but the steady kind. What do you need? What are you avoiding? Who gets affected by your choices? How can you explore without lying, without using people, without turning your life into a secret you have to protect with constant vigilance? I also started reading more intentionally, including allyship resources, because I realized something important. Even if my journey remained private, I didn't want to be ignorant about communities that have been forced to carry the consequences of public misunderstanding. I found a PFLAG guide that emphasized the difference between gender identity and gender expression and encouraged practical, respectful support, listening, using appropriate names and pronouns, and not making assumptions. It reminded me that people's lives aren't debate topics, and that competency isn't just having the right vocabulary, it's behaving with care. Source. And I looked at the existence of formal standards of care, like Path Standards of Care version 8, not because I was planning medical steps, but because it helped to see that gender-diverse experiences are addressed with seriousness and evidence-based guidance in healthcare settings, not just in online arguments. It made the whole subject feel less like a personal flaw and more like a human reality that deserves thoughtful support. Source. Over time, the questions became less panicked. I began to separate what I had always tangled together. I stopped treating clothing as a verdict. I stopped asking, what does this mean about me forever, and started asking, what does this do for me today, in my actual life? It turned out that was a healthier question. A few months after the trip, I did something that would have sounded absurd to my younger self. I went shopping calmly, in daylight, for replacement items. I didn't buy a dramatic wardrobe. I didn't buy anything designed to provoke a reaction. I bought a blouse that felt crisp and simple. I bought a skirt that fit properly and allowed me to move. I bought a pair of low, practical heels and a pair of flats because I had learned that pain is not a prerequisite for legitimacy. I also bought a blazer, not identical to the one from the suitcase, but similar in spirit, clean lines, quiet authority. On the drive home, the shopping bags in the passenger seat felt heavier than fabric. They felt like an admission. Not to the world, not yet, but to myself. I was allowed to try. I was allowed to learn. I was allowed to be a person whose identity didn't fit neatly into the first story people wrote about them. That didn't erase the hard parts. I still had to decide who to tell and when. I still had to prepare for the possibility of misunderstanding. I still had to face the way my family might react, not because they were villains, but because people carry their own fears and scripts, and sometimes love doesn't come with education attached. I started small. I told one close friend, carefully, with the kind of honesty that feels like stepping onto thin ice. I expected questions that would make me feel exposed. Instead, they said, "Okay. What do you need from me?" I hadn't realized how rarely I'd heard that sentence in relation to my inner life. We talked about boundaries. We talked about what I was and wasn't ready for. We talked about safety and mental health, about pacing, about not turning exploration into self-punishment. I emailed the woman from the hotel once, months later, not with a dramatic confession, just a simple note, "I'm grateful you handled that night with kindness. I've been taking responsibility for my life since then. I hope you're doing well." She replied a day later, "I'm glad you made it home. Walk like you belong." That line stayed with me, not as a command to perform, but as a reminder that belonging isn't always granted from outside. Sometimes it's a practice. Sometimes it's a decision you make repeatedly, even when your hands shake. Today, I don't present the same way every day. Some days I dress in the most ordinary masculine workwear imaginable and feel perfectly fine. Some days, in private, I wear the clothes I bought and let myself experience that old quiet recognition without turning it into a crisis. And sometimes, when the world feels especially heavy, I choose an outfit that makes me feel aligned and steady, because I've learned that resilience isn't just endurance, it's also allowing yourself what helps you stay whole. The biggest change isn't my closet. It's my honesty. I'm no longer spending my entire life trying to outrun a question. I'm learning to live with it, to listen to it, to let it teach me empathy for anyone who has ever had to negotiate their identity under pressure. I used to think the opposite of shame was pride. Now I think the opposite of shame is respect, respect for myself, respect for other people's boundaries, respect for the complexity of human lives. That night with the wrong suitcase could have become a humiliating story I told at my own expense. Instead, it became a hinge, the moment I realized I didn't want to keep replacing myself with a version that felt acceptable but hollow. So yes, I bought replacement items. But I wasn't replacing the suitcase outfit. I was replacing the life where I never let myself try. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.